What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Nessun studios. Michaela Vernava alongside Andre Kachtorian and joined via Skype by UFC.com's Matt Perino. Got some UFC action going down in our old, what do they call Canada? America's hat. From our neighbors to the north, Winnipeg.
Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's a fantastic time to be a Winnipeg sports fan. You got the UFC there this weekend. The Jets are in the playoff position in the NHL. I wish I was in Winnipeg right now.
Well, it should be a good fight, I think, between Robbie Lawler and Rafael Dos Anjos. Matt, I want to start with asking you what you think about this being a quote-unquote super fight. Do you think it can be classified as that or not so much?
It's a slippery slope. I would understand the logic. Champion versus former champion, two guys that, did a lot of great things in their division. But I think RDA doesn't really bring that drawing power into the fight, and neither does really Robbie for that matter. I feel like we forget what super fight means. I mean, you're talking about like a George St. Pierre versus Michael Bisping, two absolute legends of the sport. I mean, Robbie Lawler as one half definitely, merits some super fight consideration, but, I think that term gets thrown around way too much these days. But it is a very important fight, Very important fight,
and I feel like Lawler is one of the most underrated fighters in all of UFC in terms of entertainment value. This guy puts on a show every time. Every time this guy's in the octagon, it's gonna be a brawl. You know what? I'm gonna call him Lawler the Brawler, because every time he's in there, he's throwing haymakers. There's blood everywhere. The last fight at UFC 214 against Donald Cerrone was really good. It could have gone either way, and it's gonna be a fantastic one.
Matt, I think you make a good point about the overuse of the term super fight, but I'm curious if you think this would have been classified as a super fight if it had happened a couple years ago when both these guys were champions, and conversely, if there's a case to be made that this will actually be a better fight now than it would have been back then.
I think at the time, you're right. Like, if it was champion versus champion, that kind of warrants a little bit more of the super fight, discussion. But, I don't think this is too late for this fight. It's a very important fight. RDA has looked phenomenal at 170 pounds since moving up. Robbie Lawler, a guy that basically cleaned out the division before he got caught by one big punch from Tyron Woodley, a guy that's, changed camps. He's now working with Henry Hoof down in Florida. He seems rejuvenated, seems energetic again. We talked about this on a few podcasts ago, I think. It's tough to defend your belt over and over and over again. The media obligations, the having that target on your back consistently, fight after fight after fight. So to step away from the sport for about a year, Lawler did, come back, new team. What's his forte? Striking? Well, that's Henry Hoof's specialty. Formerly the team that he worked with was Black Zillions, now down at the Combat Club. All those guys, phenomenal strikers. You think of Anthony Rumble Johnson. He works with Luke Rockhold as well. So I think this is going to be an interesting fight because Robbie typically defends takedowns. If you look at Rafael Dos Anjos, the success that you would think he would have in this fight would be on the ground with his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But the problem is, you take a look at the last real big, powerful striker that RDA faced, and you're looking at Eddie Alvarez, who really, really dominated him on the feet. Well, Robbie Lawler is a more violent and a bigger and a scarier version of that. And so at 170 pounds, we're going to see how legit of a contender RDA is here in this fight.
Yeah, and you talk about RDA. He's been in the welterweight for 2 fights now. I don't know if his competition in those 2 fights has been that stiff. Neil Magny and Tarek Saffiedine. Robbie Lawler's the real deal, so this is going to be a huge test for him. And Matt's right. He's going to try to get this fight to the ground, but I think Robbie's going to try to keep it standing up as much as he can, and again try to engage in a brawl, and that's his advantage. I mean, and Matt also touched upon how his only losses in the last 7 fights has been that one punch to Tyron Woodley. This guy is a former champ, and again, as I mentioned, very underrated. He's won 6 of his last 7. Only loss was one punch to Woodley. Very underrated fighter. So I'm going to lean towards Lawler in this one.
I definitely see where you guys are coming from. And to be honest, I have a hard time not leaning that way as well. And especially what you bring up. I mean, Dos Anjos has looked good in the welterweight division. But the point that you make about the caliber of opponents he's taken on is a good one. But one thing that I really wanted to get into with you guys is the height and reach disadvantage that he's at 5'8". 70-inch reach as opposed to Robbie Lawler's 5'11", 74 inches. However, Neil Magny is 6'3", and Dos Anjos managed to take him out in the first round. So I feel like, I know Matt, you kind of already emphasize this, that he's going to have to get him on the ground, but that it's not like he hasn't taken on a taller, longer opponent before and been successful.
True, but Neil Magny's not a former champion, and that's why I side with Lawler in this one. Matt?
And, you know, not only is Lawler a former champion at 170 pounds, in another organization, he was a champion at 185 pounds. So this guy, he's going to be the much bigger fighter in there. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that RDA striking has looked really good the last couple of years, save for maybe that Alvarez performance. But you know what? He was killing himself making the weight. He's done his job. He's won 2 fights. He took out Magny, who's a tough, like, he's not a Robbie Lawler, but he's a very tough competition. Tarek Saffiedine, former champion in another organization. I don't want to, you know, make it out like RDA is some, you know, pushover in this fight, because he's not. And, you know, depending on, you know, Lawler, which one shows up, you know, if you get caught in the chin, you get caught in the chin. And Rafael Dos Anjos training down at King's MMA with Rafael Cordero, he has the potential to stand and trade with Robbie. But the tough thing about fighting Robbie Lawler is he doesn't go away. He gets stronger as the fight goes on. You look back at his fight against Rory McDonald, you know, probably, you know, maybe pound for pound, the greatest fight of all time. You know, he got pieced up in that 3rd round against McDonald, came out in the 4th and finished Rory unbelievably. So he's got a tall test on his hands. But, you know, I like RDA. I think this is a good fight, good time. If he wins, he puts himself in a really good position.
So I'm curious if you think the winner of this deserves the next crack at Tyron Woodley. I mean, that is the number 2 and number 4 ranked welterweight fighters, but interestingly, the kind of curveball that we just find out today, Woodley deciding to undergo shoulder surgery and sort of making it sound like he doesn't think that there is a worthy opponent out there at this time.
Yeah, which is very weird for me, because if it makes me think how serious that shoulder injury actually is, because assuming it is hurt, and if there was a worthy opponent, what are you going to do? Step into the octagon against a worthy opponent with a bad shoulder? It's very weird. I don't know what to make of it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. It's kind of you know, it's a perplexing, you know, run so far for Woodley. So dynamic, so talented, such a fun fighter. But, you know, he's caught some flack for a few performances, right or wrong. He's out there. He's got a couple contenders kind of rising in the division. Potential rematch with Robbie Lawler, which would be a huge fight. You got Colby Covington out there, who I know, you know, there's a lot of issues with him, you know, outside of the octagon, but inside the octagon, his resume stacks up. I mean, he's somebody that I think could be an interesting matchup for Woodley. So I understand completely him wanting to go for, you know, a money fight and, you know, trying to track down George St. Pierre. But I think at this point we've realized that George came back for a very specific reason and a specific fight against Michael Bisping, a matchup that he liked. I'm not so sure that he likes the matchup with Woodley. And, you know, we talk about super fight. That wouldn't necessarily be a super fight, you know, GSP versus Woodley. I don't know if Woodley necessarily has that kind of drawing power and that kind of star power yet. He has the potential to. Don't get me wrong. I think he is a superstar. Superstar potential is off the charts with him. I just think that he needs to dial it in and, you know, start racking up these title defenses. Maybe go out there, be a little bit more aggressive. I mean, Dana White said it himself after his fight, you know, with Wonderboy Thompson, the second one. He won that fight, and it was just like, you know, you kind of left that fight wondering, like, you know, could he been a little bit more aggressive? Could he done things a little bit different? But then you have the counter argument that, well, you got to go in these fights to win these fights, and game planning is a part of the sport. So he's in a tough spot. I mean, he's winning, he's building on his legacy, but, you know, if the perception isn't there that, you know, you are building that big legacy that you're claiming to build, then how real is it?
Yeah, it's interesting because Woodley, he gets a lot of criticism for being like a boring defensive fighter, but I don't know, when I look at his last title defense, what did he do? Stuff what, 24, 25 takedowns in that fight? That's unbelievable. He just, all he does is stuff takedowns. He's a very defensive fighter, which is why if Lawler does win this fight, I would love to see that rematch, because Lawler's is a brawler, as I said, so it's gonna be a lot more difficult to stuff those takedowns. Maybe Woodley will be forced to kind of finish the fight, which pretty much goes against what he's been doing in his title defenses, which going the distance, being more defensive. So I think, and that'll be very interesting to see Woodley being forced to kind of finish a fight rather than going all the distance.
Well, guys, I think it's interesting that both of you just made hypotheticals if Robbie Lawler takes on Tyron Woodley. And Matt, I know you said that you're not saying that this is going to be an easy fight, but it does sort of sound like both you guys are already writing off Dos Anjos in terms of, but let's just say he does pull off the win over Lawler. Do you think he's a worthy opponent for Tyron Woodley or not so much?
I would say so.
For sure.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be a better fight than Dos Anjos versus Lawler?
No, I've talked about how entertaining Lawler is. Anytime Lawler's in the octagon, I want to see him fight, especially against a champion like Woodley, who the public really doesn't like that much. They think he's boring, he's defensive. That'll be exciting. I don't know what you think, though, Matt.
I'd like to see Dos Anjos versus Woodley as well. I mean, if he beats Robbie Lawler, I mean, you have to think he's going to take that number 2 ranking, which puts him above Covington in the rankings, and he's on a 3-fight win streak since coming up at welterweight. Hasn't lost yet in the division. And you just took out the former champ, so I think that puts him in prime position for a title shot. There's a lot of people out there, I think, in this division. I mean, you got a guy on the card itself who could be a fight or two away from this conversation, and Mike Perry, who there's a lot of parallels to be made between Perry's fighting style and Robbie Lawler's. I mean, a guy that goes out there, aggressive, comes forward, slings big shots, kicks, knees. I mean, he knocked out his last opponent, Alex Reyes, with a big knee. A guy that, has a lot of star potential, and a guy that likes to talk. He's trained a little bit with Tyron Woodley, too. There's a respect factor there. But he said he's coming for that belt, so, I mean, if he gets into the conversation, if he can take out Ponzinibbio, huge test, going to be a real interesting striking battle. That's another guy that you could throw in the mix. There's a lot of potential fights. I mean, I don't agree with Woodley. I think the welterweight division still, there's a lot of good fights out there.
Probably the best name in UFC as well, Santiago Ponzinibbio. I love it.
All right, guys. Well, we'll check in again next week. Matt, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you, and don't think for a moment that I didn't catch that we didn't have an episode after 218. After all of my, prognostications came true. I understand. I know how Andre plays this game.
No, you did a great job on that. I whiffed on everything, but that's okay. You win some, you lose some.